B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, November 9th, 2018. As wildfires burn California again, driven by climate change, a federal court in Montana has surprised us by issuing an injunction blocking the final approval of construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. These stories are connected. Yesterday, as I typically do, I record this podcast. I load it up on the internet, and then I head out for a little break and take a walk with Chloe, my beloved studio dog. And yesterday, after the podcast, I went outdoors. When I had last looked out, it was sunny and clear, but the skies had clouded up. The smell of smoke was in the air, and by this morning, a fine layer of ash covered the ground and our cars 130 miles south of the fire that has devastated the small town of Paradise. And John Milton's book title has unfortunately been borne out. Paradise is lost. The town lays in ruins. 25,000 people evacuated, and we know that there were some fatalities. But it is too soon and too hot to go in and investigate. And the wildfires that have plagued California over the past 5 years continue to grow in their devastation, in their burning of populated areas and threat to human structures and human life. And I want to single out a couple of people who I know are affected. Paul Elsesser is a longtime listener, one of the most generous supporters of this podcast, and he and his wife Vicki live in Durham, which is near Chico. And as of yesterday, they reported on Facebook that they were safe, but planning their evacuation. And you may recall Ray Lutz. Ray is the activist in San Diego who takes on the San Onofre nuclear power plant shutdown and the storage of that nuclear waste. He is also a very active election integrity advocate. And he posted on Facebook that his sister lived in Paradise, and her husband and her suffered a deep loss yesterday as their house was destroyed by fire. So it's truly devastating. There are other fires, one adding to the brutal psychic injury to the city of Thousand Oaks in Ventura County, which was the scene of the shooting of a dozen people at the Country Western Dance Club. And the next morning, they woke up to a fire raging in their community. Also, the Tony Coaside community of Malibu has been evacuated as fire advances there as well. And the connection here is that my friend Frank Egger, who is a founder of the North Coast Rivers Alliance, and they are co-plaintiffs in the case in Montana, in Great Falls, challenging the approval by Donald Trump of the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. And Frank is celebrating his 80th birthday. Sometime in the next few days, there is a fundraiser for the North Coast Rivers Alliance this Sunday in Fairfax, California, and they're going to be celebrating with attorney Steve Volker because they persuaded this judge that the manner in which Trump overturned President Obama's delayed rejection of the Keystone XL pipeline. You remember he dilly-dallied along, and he fainted this way and fainted that way, and Bill McKibben kept giving him the benefit of the doubt. And then finally, after courts had basically decided for him, Obama did take formal steps to block the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. But on his second day in office, Trump overturned that with an executive order, and it was the way he did that the court decided was inappropriate, illegal, and has been overturned with an injunction placed on any continued construction of Keystone XL. And Trump has not learned his lesson, because just like the original Muslim travel ban, like the DACA ruling that was overturned by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals here in San Francisco a couple of days ago, The president has the authority to do these things. But the way Trump exercises that authority doesn't meet the muster of the courts. So Judge Morris, in this case, found that Trump did not adequately account for how a decline in oil prices might affect the pipeline's viability. In addition, the government's analysis didn't fully study the potential for oil spills or the cumulative effects of greenhouse gas emissions from the Keystone pipeline in combination with the Alberta Clipper, which was approved back in 2009. The ruling specifically takes the Trump administration to task for failing to address the Obama administration's arguments about climate change, including the need to keep rising global temperatures at safe levels, as a basis for denying the permit. The judge said the department instead simply discarded prior factual findings related to climate change to support its course reversal. An agency cannot simply disregard contrary or inconvenient factual determinations. And I paused when I read inconvenient there because it echoes Al Gore's movie title, Inconvenient Truth. Let me repeat what the judge wrote here. An agency cannot simply disregard contrary or inconvenient factual determinations that it made in the past any more than it can ignore inconvenient facts when it writes on a blank slate. The judge said that the Trump administration failed to present facts or a reasoned explanation. Rather, the government had declared that it was embracing a policy shift toward energy security, economic development, and infrastructure, and noted that there had been numerous developments related to global action to address climate change. So, score one for the water protectors. And I really commend Frank Egger. He has been fighting these battles through the North Coast Rivers Alliance for decades. Here in California, they were granted standing in the case in Montana, and I applaud him for persisting in this matter all the way to a significant victory. Well, we've got a fresh interview with Greg Palast. I'm releasing today to my subscribers at peterbcollins.com, at iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spreaker. He's on the ground in Atlanta, Georgia, where the post-election contests continue with a very narrow gap between Republican Brian Kemp and Democrat Stacey Abrams. And before we get to Palast's reporting, I'm looking at a front-page story in Friday's New York Times. They make no mention in about a 1,200-word story of the voter purging that preceded Tuesday's election, driven by a candidate in the race, Brian Kemp, whose self-interest as Secretary of State and candidate for governor converged as he purged hundreds of thousands of qualified voters from the registration rolls in Georgia. And the New York Times reduces all of this in both Florida and in Georgia to bickering. Headline reads, "No clear-cut winner, but lots of bickering in Florida and Georgia." And that belies the seriousness of the challenges that are being conducted in both states, where voter purging, voter suppression, and other forms of election fraud are tilting these races toward Republicans, and they're using the Bush playbook from 2000, which is to claim victory whether you own it or not, and then just describe the opposition as sore losers and people who are trying to steal the election. And it's playing out in Florida now as Rick Scott is taking legal efforts to stop votes from being counted. Because his lead has been diminished to 15,000, it triggers a required recount if it stops there. And this is getting uglier and uglier by the minute, and it's not just bickering. This is a routine that the Republicans have used for years. And listen to this excerpt from my interview with Greg Palast, which was recorded last evening, about 6:45 Eastern Time, and brings you up to date on the purges that have led to the serious doubts that Brian Kemp is actually the winner in Georgia. Here's Greg Palast.
But the problem is you expose one of these characters, and then you're on the next. So I'm in Atlanta because Brian Kemp, who is a crony of Kobach's, in fact, used there are 108,000 people purged from the Georgia voter rolls based on the phony purge list that Kobach gave to Kemp, 108,000 on the grounds. He gave them this so-called cross-check list, which Kobach told me he gave to Kemp to say, these are the people who left Georgia. Well, I had the top experts in the nation who confirm where you live. You know, they you don't pay your bill. They know where to find you. And they went through each name by computer, of course, and they said 106,000 of those 108,000 people have never moved from their voter registration address. In addition, altogether, 340,134 people that Brian Kemp said had moved from the state had moved nowhere. A third of a million voters, and they got no notice that they were being purged.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Greg Palast. Runs about 20 minutes, and Greg had limited time yesterday, but he has agreed after all of this is resolved to return for a lengthy debriefing. And the work that I do here is made possible by listeners like you who support my work with your subscriptions. People like Susan Gavet, like Cliff Johnson, Carl Howard, and our friend Ann Heyman, who is still recovering from the hurricane in Florida. I appreciate that they contribute money to support this, and you can do it too, as little as $5 a month. That's not so hard, is it? Not for most people. Just drop into peterbcollins.com, click on the menu, click on Become a Subscriber. When you get to the sign-up page, you can choose $5, $10, $20 a month. The $50 annual subscription earns you our bonus gift, a copy of John Dist's new rock and roll CD called American University. So the contest in Florida has gotten action and commentary from the guy who plays president these days, and it is getting murky because, as I referenced before you heard from Greg Palast there, in both the Senate race, where sitting Governor Rick Scott, is trying to declare that he has already beaten Senator Bill Nelson, the incumbent, they've brought in the lawyers. And this leads Rick Scott to say, I will not sit idly by while unethical liberals try to steal this election from the people of Florida. Then Trump chimes in, probably on a coordinated basis. Law enforcement is looking into another big corruption scandal having to do with election fraud in Broward and Palm Beach. Now, it's interesting he used the term election fraud, because that's what I routinely say it is. Trump usually talks about non-existent voter fraud. And I don't know if that is a slip or if he thinks that it's local officials who are going to commit what he considers to be fraud by trying to count all the votes. And there are a lot of uncounted ballots in the predominantly Democratic county of Broward. And Trump and Scott are trying to create the illusion that they've already won, and it's just these sore loser Democrats back in Florida trying to game the system, trying to, Trump even suggested that they were, no, I guess it was actually Rush Limbaugh who I heard was suggesting that they were finding blank ballots and filling them out after the election. And, of course, there's no evidence of any of this. It's just pure speculation that they use to fuel the spin that they are catapulting out there, as George W. Bush used to call it. So the registration count, almost 600,000 Democrats in Broward, only 250,000 Republicans. It's the place where the hanging chads were found in 2000. And in 2016, it was the scene where Tim Canova, the guy who challenged Debbie Wasserman Schultz, he ended up suing the Broward election officials because they had destroyed the ballots from that race, so he was unable to use the digital copies to conduct an audit, and that's a violation of federal law that requires congressional ballots to be saved for 22 months after an election. And there's some good commentary from Philip Bump in the Washington Post today. Let me quote a few lines. The GOP filed a lawsuit Thursday hoping to halt vote counting in Broward County, where updated totals have moved incumbent Senator Bill Nelson into position for an automatic recount. Governor Scott, in a news conference, said Trump in a tweet alleged that the drop in vote totals was a function of voter fraud. Now they've shifted from election fraud to voter fraud. You get this? Bump writes, it's important to note there is no evidence that the votes being counted in Broward are anything other than legitimate votes cast by Florida voters. As is often the case with allegations of voter fraud, critics are pointing to past questions, but no current evidence. He goes on, there's an obvious benefit to Scott and the Republican Party in using whiffs of smoke to imply that Broward and other counties are trying to unfairly shift the results of the election. The more obvious attempt by a state official to affect the results of the vote is, of course, Scott's own criticism of a recount. And that is an attempt to manipulate the election by one of the candidates. So, Trump states, if you look at Broward, they've had a horrible history, and all of a sudden they're finding votes out of nowhere, and Rick Scott, who won by, it was close, but he won by a comfortable margin, every couple of hours it goes down a little bit. And Bump corrects him. That part about Scott winning is not true. At the end of election night, he had a lead, but all the votes hadn't been counted. Trump also tied his voter fraud conspiracy theory into another conspiracy theory that was launched by Sean Hannity on television last night. And that's because Bill Nelson, the incumbent Democratic senator in Florida, has hired one of the top Democratic election lawyers, Mark Elias. And Mark Elias represented the Clinton campaign in the DNC, and he hired Fusion GPS that hired Christopher Steele that produced the dodgy dossier. And so that's all they need to say that Fusion GPS is a part of some scam to rig the election outcome in Florida. And there's no indication that Fusion GPS, which is an opposition research company of dubious ethics, they don't get involved in operations like that in any way that we have knowledge of from the past. Yesterday, I led the podcast by declaring that Trump has provoked a constitutional crisis by firing Jeff Sessions, which I'm okay with, and replacing him with this loyalist hatchet man, Matt Whitaker. And as I scanned the news, and certainly I can't read everything or watch everything that is published or broadcast every day, but I have only found one other reference to these events as a constitutional crisis. And that's from my friend Brad Friedman at bradblog.com. Nancy Pelosi doesn't consider it a crisis. The New York Times didn't run a lead editorial calling it a crisis today. They lectured Democrats on how to maintain moderate behavior with the new majority in the House of Representatives. And as thousands of people, if not millions, took to the streets in all 50 states last night, and there was actually a little coverage because we weren't protesting wars, or other things that corporations profit from. And so Rachel Maddow showed scenes in 6 different cities. I was out on the streets here with friends in San Rafael, California. It was a nice, well-behaved group. They didn't want to linger too long. After about 45 minutes, they all went home to dinner. But they made their stand and made their statement. And so I find it appalling that the Democratic leadership and the left commentary leaders in this country are not outraged, are not calling for people to protest this unconstitutional move. And the Democrats should be threatening lawsuits. They should look at every way they can to draw attention to this very dark sequence of events. And we'll get to their reaction in a moment, but it's really limp. I just want to add to what I described yesterday about Matt Whitaker's background, that he ran a dark money-funded organization called the Foundation for Accountability and Civic Trust. It was a right-wing response to CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. And he only targeted Hillary Clinton and other Democrats with his advocacy. And because it was funded by dark money groups, and we know that Matt Whitaker was the only paid employee of FACT, it deserves further scrutiny. Also, the company that he worked with, he was a founder of and on the board of, that marketed patents for individuals, was shut down earlier this year, accused of $26 million in fraudulent transactions. And that alone should produce alarm bells. But this Trump loyalist who auditioned for the job on TV by criticizing Mueller and the investigation and telegraphing what he would do if he were given the chance, he's now been given the chance. And today, Trump, as he was heading for the helicopter, to fly to Europe for the memorials of World War I, he told reporters, "I don't know Matt Whitaker." But Matt Whitaker is a very highly respected man. Now, usually Trump says he doesn't know people he knows after he fires them or they get indicted or they take a plea deal, like Michael Cohen. He barely knows him now. But to appoint somebody and the next day say, "I don't know him?" I mean, this just doesn't make any sense. But as the New York Times laments, the move does raise a lot of concerns about the future of the special counsel. And it's pretty clear that the window for Matt Whitaker to do his dirty deeds is between here and the end of the year during the lame duck session of the Congress. Now, yesterday, we led with the op-ed that was co-authored by Neil Katyal and George Conway III. And I referred to George Conway as Mr. Kellyanne Conway. And guess what Trump called him today? Mr. Kellyanne Conway. And he dismissed the commentary about the unconstitutional move, saying that Kellyanne's husband was only interested in publicity. Well, I thought that was what she specialized in. Trump dismissed concerns that Whitaker hadn't been confirmed by the Senate, noting that Mueller hadn't been confirmed either. But, I haven't been confirmed by the Senate, and I'm not required to be confirmed, as neither is Bob Mueller. That's just total bullshit red herring. Trump also labeled a question from a reporter about whether he wants Whitaker to restrict Mueller's investigation as stupid. And this morning, Chuck Schumer, who loves the camera, stood in front of several and said Trump has ignored the statutory line of succession, potentially violated the appointment clause of the Constitution, which requires all principal officers of the government to be nominated by the president by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. Hey, Chuck, how about screaming, "This is unconstitutional. We will not stand for it. I demand that Republicans join me in rejecting this unconstitutional act by Donald Trump." Now, can you see that his quote was a lot more passive than mine? I think that epitomizes where the Democrats stand. So here's a piece from Charlie Savage and Mark Mazzetti in the Times today, wondering about exactly what Whitaker will do. It's unknown how active a role he'll play in overseeing the special counsel's work, and that Rod Rosenstein is still on the job. It's unclear whether he'll report to Whitaker on this stuff or Whitaker will cut him out and directly try to manage Mueller. And as you know, I have these mixed feelings about Bob Mueller and about the Russia probe. I believe we've already established obstruction of justice by this president in the firing of Comey, in the plea deal of Michael Cohen. And so I don't have these grave concerns that if the Mueller investigation is inappropriately shut down, that there is no way forward to discipline Trump or ultimately impeach him. It's up to the Democrats, and they are whiffing. Now, on a conference call yesterday, Adam Schiff, Jerry Nadler, who will head the Judiciary Committee, and Nancy Pelosi and Elijah Cummings, that's the leadership of the House for the Democrats, they talked about a resolution to protect Mueller's work. Well, come on. The Republicans still control the House until January. That measure is going nowhere. And at the polite rally here in Marin County last night, the attendees were told to call their Democratic members of Congress and the Senate and demand that Whitaker recuse himself from the Russia investigation. And that's so misguided. That's like saying, pretty please, follow the rules, be polite, be nice. That's not Whitaker. That's not what he's there for. And the Democrats need to put some fighting words in the words that they're using. Here's Adam Schiff. We will be scrutinizing any action taken to impede the Mueller investigation. And for the new acting attorney general, he needs to understand we'll keep an eye on any action that he or others might take to interfere with the administration of justice. Adam, it's going to be over by the time you get around to your meandering effort to rein them in. And the Times article goes on, if Mueller exhausts all of his efforts to get Trump to answer questions, he could seek to subpoena the president. If Whitaker orders Mueller to hold off and he complies, that could trigger a regulatory requirement that Justice Department officials notify Congress that happened. Or if Mueller defied them, then Whitaker could fire him. Over at The Atlantic, Benjamin Wittes, who is basically the guy who speaks for St. James Comey these days, he published a lengthy piece with a list of 10 items about why it's probably too late to stop Bob Mueller. And he talks about how the Cohen investigation was shifted to New York so that if Mueller gets shut down, that is unaffected. And he responds to a Watergate prosecutor who says that Mueller has missed his moment. Then he goes into his list of 10 points. Mueller has spread his wealth around. I mentioned the Cohen prosecution in New York. The investigation has progressed very far. The effort to suppress a report could be politically galvanizing and in its own way as damaging for the administration as the contents of the report. Well, but if the report is heavily redacted or never sees the public light, that is a very clear option that the Republicans have and a likely step that Whitaker will take. Then he says, well, Mueller could go public and hold a news conference and complain about what's going on. I don't believe that would accomplish a whole lot. I wouldn't mind if he did that, but I'm not sure it would affect anything. Then he claims the midterms matter, and as I point out, that doesn't matter until January, and this will probably be all worked out by then. Then he says, well, you got the confirmation hearings for Jeff Sessions' replacement, but that again doesn't happen until next year after the blood will have been let. And then he prays that Matt Whitaker is going to have a change of heart when he sees what Bob Mueller's actually got in his jacket. Jason Leopold's at it again using the Freedom of Information Act over at BuzzFeed. Got a hold of a letter from November of 2016, so it was after the election, signed by 8 Democratic senators, sent to President Obama, asking him to declassify materials related to the allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 election. And it's kind of an interesting letter, but Jason undermines it by quoting 3 unnamed intelligence sources, trying to help him guess what the redacted portions actually say. And, that's just speculation because we can't prove that what they say is accurate, especially if we don't know who they are. Anyway, it has some minor interest. I've linked to it, and you can read it for yourself, along with the talking points that were issued by the spooks to the electeds on how they should handle the delicate issues of the early stages of the Russiagate narrative. Well, Trump has carried out a threat that he made before the midterm elections to change the rules about asylum for migrants who come to the United States. And the basic change is that he is claiming that he can eliminate asylum requests that occur outside of official border crossing stations. So if you swim the Rio Grande and you go into El Paso and say, hey, I'd like to apply for asylum, he's saying, boom, you can be immediately deported. But according to the ACLU, lawyer Omar Jadwat, the law is clear. People can apply for asylum whether or not they're at a port of entry and regardless of their immigration status, legal or illegal. The president doesn't get to ignore that law, even if he dislikes it. So this is another move to pander to the base that will be challenged in the courts. It will affect some people attempting to apply for asylum in the near future, and it will likely evaporate. Just like coverage of the dangerous migrant caravan that was ready to invade our southern border right before the midterm elections. According to a Washington Post analysis, in the week before the election, the caravan was mentioned on Fox, on both the Fox News and Fox Business Channel, more than 80 times, typically 3 mentions per hour, sometimes 8 mentions per hour, and that has been reduced to almost 0 at this point. Do you get the idea that that was just a political stunt? Well, I think you do and I do. But on Facebook last night, one of my old friends, Tony Medea, is clinging to the fearful talking points that Trump was thundering before the election. And I'm really sorry to see that. The Acosta story hasn't died yet, as Trump keeps it alive by threatening to deny the credentials of other reporters. And he lectured the reporters as he departed for Europe today. When you're in the White House, this is a very sacred place for me, a very special place. You have to treat the White House with respect. You have to treat the presidency with respect. Well, look, Trump, if you actually believe that, and I know you don't, then why don't you moderate your behavior? Because you set the tone with your rude, your insulting behavior, your constant interruption of the reporters you've called on who are trying to complete a question. You answer it and belittle them before they have even finished the question. And that's what created the back and forth, in my view, with CNN's Jim Acosta the other day. And as we know, and as I reviewed for you yesterday, the president has gone on a bender against African-American reporters, belittling them, telling them to sit down, including April Ryan, who he thinks is now working at CNN, and I'm not really sure. She was last listed as the correspondent for the American Urban Radio Networks. In any event, he just brought her up without any prompting today. You talk about somebody that's a loser. She doesn't know what the hell she's doing, he said of April Ryan. She gets publicity and then she gets a pay raise or a contract, I think, CNN, but she's very nasty. And she shouldn't be. She shouldn't be. You got to treat the White House and the office of the presidency with respect. But what he really means is that he wants to humiliate these people into submission. He wants them to only praise him and only report the wonderful things that he says he's doing. And he's surprised that they won't knuckle under. And there's a lot of drama still over the allegedly doctored videotape that was worked over at InfoWars. And it certainly, even if they didn't falsely edit it, they used techniques that did enhance the impression that Jim Acosta had intentionally made contact with the unnamed White House intern who repeatedly touched him as she tried to grab the microphone away. We've been distracted by the horrors of the caravan and the midterm elections. The U.S. Navy has some bad news to report. Back on the 12th of June, the USS Trenton was cruising in the Mediterranean off the coast of Sicily. A large inflatable with way too many refugees on it trying to cross from northern Africa to Europe were foundering. And initially, the USS Trenton moved away from these people in crisis. 6 survivors say that the U.S. cruiser was near their boat before it sank, but appeared to ignore their request for help. We saw that ship. It was not far away. We saw the American flag. If they had rescued us when they were all still on board, 76 people would not have died. The dinghy had left Libya with 117 people on board. Rough seas, the boat started to fill with water, and they tried to flag down this American ship. So initially they changed direction, the ship did. Then they returned. The Trenton returned to the scene half an hour after the refugee craft had sunk and picked up some survivors. When those survivors asked the Americans why they hadn't intervened before, they said, "Oh, that's not our job." Meanwhile, at the end of October, we are just learning, there was a near collision in a game of chicken between a Chinese warship and the USS Decatur, which is a destroyer. The Decatur saw this Chinese ship moving up behind it. It blasted its whistle. Instead, the Chinese crew didn't change their course, but they started to load fenders on the side of their ship, preparing for a collision. And the Times reports only a sharp starboard turn by the Decatur avoided a disaster in the calm equatorial waters in that early morning. It was actually in September, I guess, not October. The ships came within 45 yards of each other until the USS blinked, the USS Decatur blinked. The actual date here is September 30th. I want to get that correct. And so this apparently is not an isolated incident. And today, Secretary of Defense Mad Dog Mattis was meeting with his Chinese counterpart, Wei Fenghe, and this was one of the items on their agenda. And finally today, a recommended weekend read, an op-ed published in today's New York Times by Michelle Alexander, who published The New Jim Crow about 8 years ago, and she follows up with really important questions about the move away from cash bail. And I support ending the cash bail system. But she notes that what replaces it is electronic monitoring that is run by corporate prison operators. And she makes a strong case that this is not forward progress. I'm late on my timeline today, so I won't quote further from it, but I highly recommend Ms. Alexander's piece for your consumption. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. We'll be off on Monday for the Veterans Holiday. Back here Tuesday at peterbcollins.com.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.